Today I would like to spend a few minutes considering the parable of the talents. This parable is found in Matthew chapter 25. As Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives with his disciples just a few days before his crucifixion, he answered a number of their questions about the fate of the city of Jerusalem, and especially of his second coming. And so in this context, we read about Jesus teaching in a series of parables about the importance of preparing for his coming. And the message in these parables as a whole was you need to be prepared, be ready. Well, the parable of the talents emphasizes the lesson that disciples must take care of the things that he has entrusted into us until he comes again. So we want to start out by reading this parable. It's somewhat lengthy. We'll read the entirety of it, and it begins in Matthew 25, verse 14. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them, and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents. He said, Master, you've entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I've gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival you would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him, and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, this is a familiar story, and it contains a great lesson on the principle of what we call stewardship, the principle of stewardship. The idea of a steward is someone to whom the head of a house might entrust the management of his affairs. The steward is someone who is made responsible for properly using the things that have been entrusted to him. That is, managing affairs placed in his charge. It all revolves around the idea of trust. And of course this trust is the principle of stewardship. So let's think about the Bible principle of stewardship a little bit more at this point. Just as the affairs and the things in the parable belonged to the master, we know that Scripture teaches that God is the master and owner of everything that he has created. We think, for example, about the 50th Psalm. In verse 10, the Lord says, For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountains, and everything that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all it contains. what that reminds us of is that everything in this creation belongs to God, who is the Creator. And so, just as the servants in the story were only using what really belonged to the master, the principle that we start with is that we as stewards are only using the things that belong to God. So the principle of stewardship applies to us, and in that sense, each of us should see ourselves as a steward, someone to whom things have been entrusted. And so that's where we start. And then we also need to be reminded that every servant in the story was entrusted with something according to his ability. Not everyone received the same amount. Some were entrusted with more, some with less. And what they received when they received the talent, of course, was a sum of money. And so while each servant was given a different amount of money, each was entrusted with the responsibility to put the money to good use by investing it wisely. In the end, two of the servants were referred to as good and faithful servants, because they used what the master had placed in their care, and they used it well. They invested and took advantage of the opportunity to bring an increase to their master in the use of that which had been entrusted to them. Good and faithful servant. But that stands in stark contrast to how the third servant was referred to. He was called fearful. He was called wicked and lazy, worthless. That's how his master ultimately thought of him. And so the difference was how they used what had been entrusted to them, the things that had been placed in their care. And so we need to understand that we are responsible for how we use what God has given to us. And finally, in the story, the master comes and settles accounts with them. There would be a day of accounting. They have to answer for how they have fulfilled their responsibility, how they have dealt with the stewardship, the trust that has been given to them. And that's just a reminder to us that each of us will be called to give an account of our stewardship before God. Someday He is going to call us to stand before Him, and as Romans 14 says, each one of us will give an account of himself to God. That's the principle of stewardship. But we also might want to ask the question, what has been entrusted to us as stewards? And the reality is that all of us have received certain gifts. We're all stewards to some degree. No one is exempted from this. There are various statements to this effect in the New Testament, such as the one that Peter makes in 1 Peter 4, verse 10, where he says, as each one has received a gift, we should employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So all the things that we have come to us as a result of God's grace, but we are to use the gift that's been given to us as a good steward. So what's been entrusted to us? Well, these gifts may take various forms. It might be our material possessions. Those have been given to us by God. All of our wealth comes from God. In Deuteronomy 8 and verse 18, Moses reminded the people, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who is giving you power to make wealth, that He may confirm His covenant, which He swore to your fathers as it is this day. Yes, God gives us the ability to make a living, to accumulate wealth. And so all the wealth that we have, we need to recognize that ultimately it all comes from God. As God said in the days of Haggai, when the prophet was appealing to people to use their energies and their resources in the rebuilding of the temple, he says, the silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. It all belongs to the Lord. And of course, when we think about our money, there are different ways that we might use it. Unfortunately, a lot of times we make the mistake of making money our master. This is the selfish approach. Someone has said that money is a good servant, but a poor master. Jesus said that no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And Paul gave the warning when he wrote to Timothy, 1 Timothy 6, verse 10, when he says, "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." That's what happens when we allow our money, our wealth, to become our master, and the consequences can be grievous when we make that mistake. Instead, what we ought to do with the money, the wealth, the material possessions that we have from God is to make them our servant, and to use them in the service of God and the service of others. It's like what Paul wrote to the Christians in Ephesus when he says that he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, he says, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. There's a proper way to look at our wealth and to regard these material things that God has given us, and it all is a matter of stewardship. And when we remember these principles of good stewardship regarding the money that we have, the key to fulfilling our obligations is in giving to the needs of our fellow man and giving to support the good work of the gospel. All of those good things that we're able to do with the things God's entrusted us with. We might also think of the stewardship that we have as our time and opportunities. We've been entrusted with a lot of time, and the time amounts to opportunities, and we're responsible for making the best use of the time that God has given us to be able to serve God and to serve others. Paul said, "Be careful how you walk, and don't be unwise, but be wise, and make the best use of your time." Or he says, "Redeem the time" in some translations, because the days are evil. That is, make the most of every opportunity in every walk, every aspect of our walk in life. Someone has said that time is the only money that cannot be counterfeited. It is currency, isn't it? It is the most valuable currency that we have, the time that we have. Someone else has also said that tomorrow is often the busiest day of the world. We don't use our time wisely sometimes, and we procrastinate and we say, "Well, I can do it tomorrow." Well, of course, that's simply wasting the valuable resource of time that God has given us. Do we not all have the same amount of time given to us? So we ought to ask ourselves the question, how am I using the time that I've been given? Am I using it only for myself? Am I just using it on things that are frivolous? Or am I using it for things that are most important? It's a question of stewardship. And we might also think of this in terms of the abilities that we have. Some of our abilities are natural, innate. Others are things that we learn, skills that we acquire, knowledge that we learn. Some of our abilities are mental, intellectual in nature. Others may be physical. But abilities are important. It's been said that ability is the most important tool in your life. These are great gifts that we have, whatever our ability might be. But we're responsible for how we use those gifts. Someone has said that it's better to have a little ability and use it well than to have much ability and make poor use of it. And so the example of the Apostle Paul is so admirable when he says, "If I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For I'm under compulsion," he says. "I'm under compulsion, for woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me." Do you see that? That's in 1 Corinthians 9. You see that Paul sees this as a stewardship. That is, the opportunity to preach the gospel, because he knew that he had the ability and the opportunity to do so. So we again ask the question, are we using the abilities that God has granted us, the abilities we've been blessed with to be able to serve God and man? And in that same sense then, we think about the gospel of Christ, and that's a stewardship too. Paul said, "Let a man regard us in this manner as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. In this case, moreover, it is required of stewards that one be found trustworthy." 1 Corinthians 4, 1 and 2. So we think about the mysteries of God. That's referring to the gospel plan of redemption, and we've been entrusted with that, and we are to be good stewards. Into our hands the gospel is given. Our lyrics from a great hymn, and it's a great concept. The power of God to save, that's the gospel. The power of God to save has been placed in our hands. So how are we using it? Are we fulfilling our responsibilities as good stewards? So what lessons can we take away from this brief consideration of the parable of the talents? Well, for one thing, just be reminded that everyone has received something from God. Everyone has received a gift or gifts to be used to His glory. Our abilities may differ. Our opportunities to develop our gifts may differ from one person to another. Our innate endowments will vary from person to person. But everyone has received something from God. And regardless of the gifts that we've been given, our stewardship is therefore to use those gifts to the very best of our ability. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes we fail because we don't try. Rather than doubting our abilities and our potential for good, like the one-talent man, we need to trust ourselves, just as God has trusted us. We need to try. Sometimes we fail because we are afraid. Success is the result of hard work and of seizing the opportunity. There's often a risk involved. The one-talent man failed not because he only had one talent. He failed because he didn't try. He failed because he was afraid of the possibility of failure. And so he ended up squandering his opportunity. Let's not squander the opportunities that God has placed before us, whether they are great or small, whether they are many or few. Let's use them. Let's have the courage to use those gifts. Ultimately, our failures, when we do fail, our failures often betray a lack of faith in God Himself. That servant that was described as wicked and lazy pictured his master as a hard man. And so in the same way, if you or I have such a view of God, we just might make the mistake of thinking that God would lay upon us more than we can handle. What a mistake that would be. God's not like that. He never requires anything of us without first giving us the means to accomplish the task. So we need to have faith in God. God's never going to place anything upon us that's greater than we can fulfill. We need to fulfill our stewardship. This parable teaches that when we use what God has given us, He rewards us. He rewards us with more gifts, more opportunities, and of course the ultimate reward of entering into the joy of the Lord. But sadly, if we fail to use our gifts, just like we see in the parable here, if we fail to use the gifts that God has given us, they'll be taken away from us. Because the principle is that we lose what we fail to use. We know that's true in life. We lose what we fail to use. Someday you and I are going to stand before our Lord to give an account, to give an answer, to be held accountable for the stewardship that we have been given. How are we going to answer? What are we going to say? How will we give an account of our stewardship?